Hello everyone. Back many moons ago, I used to really like writing a lot. I wrote a couple of novels and even got a couple of them close to where they might be publishable. But then I went through my marriage and subsequent divorce, and for quite some time, the creative spark fizzled for a bit. The reason I bring that up is because recently I've started to write again, and it's been a lot of fun. But more specifically, the current work in progress I have going is a time travel story. I'm not going to give any more details on the plot than that, but when it comes to time travel itself, I've got a couple of rules that I follow because it's almost impossible to write a time travel story without giant plot holes. Ultimately, I do think that this should give us a good indication on the possibility of time travel in reality, when you come to think of it. Anyway, the reason I even bothered to mention it, and the reason for this video, comes about in part because I am a determinist. Now, that might not seem like it is connected, but just bear with me for a while. To be even clear on where I stand, I'm a Calvinist, which is to say a Christian who holds to Reformed theology. And one of the aspects of Calvinism deals with predestination. What's interesting, at least to me, is that I would actually still be a determinist even if I ceased to be a theist. I actually have a somewhat unique trajectory when it comes to how my views came about. See, I started off as a rather basic Christian and just sort of took for granted that I had free will, because everyone always says that we have free will, and I never put any thought into it. Because why would you? Well, it turns out in high school, my best friend was an atheist, and he's the reason why you have to put thought into it, because he challenged me on the fundamental contradiction between thinking that God is sovereign and that we have free will. Now, this video isn't going to get too far into that particular aspect. Suffice to say, after we had our conversations on the topic, I remember going home and running up to my dad and saying, "Hey, Dad, how do we prove that we have free will?" And my dad surprised me. His response was, "Who says we have free will?" And then he pulled out a book off his bookshelf, and it was called Chosen by God by R.C. Sproul. And that was the first argument that showed me biblically why free will, specifically the idea of libertarian free will, and that will become important soon. But that was the first book that showed me that it didn't fit with multiple passages of the Bible. And roughly a month or so after this, I became a diehard Calvinist myself. But as I said, I would hold the view of determinism even if I became an atheist. And that's because when I started to learn physics, all of Newtonian physics just is determinism in its origin. Of course, many people hold out hope that quantum mechanics can rescue free will in terms of physics. I don't think that happens at all, of course, and that's because of the final reason that I still hold to determinism. And that's because I am a compatibilist. Now, like the name implies, I'm arguing that something is compatible with something else. And since the topic of discussion is determinism, you would be right to conclude that one of those things I'm talking about is determinism. So what is it that I'm saying determinism is compatible with? Well, the most usual definition of compatibilism is the belief that determinism is compatible with free will. And that is true so far as it goes, but I kind of want to dig into it a bit deeper because, well, first of all, I've told you I totally reject the idea of libertarian free will. So there's already a specific definition of free will that I would be incompatible with. And that's really the point that we need to look at. What is it specifically about free will which makes people want to say that they hold a view that is compatible with free will? I think when you boil it down, there's only one really relevant factor, and that is what deals with moral responsibility. And this is where I am coming from as a compatibilist, because I hold to the view that determinism is completely compatible with moral responsibility. And in fact, I would go so far as to argue that only determinism is compatible with moral responsibility, which is to say, yes, I believe that libertarian free will is incompatible with moral responsibility. So that's the introduction here to this video. Let's dig into it a bit. First of all, what do I mean when I talk about determinism? Here's where my initial point about writing a story about time travel becomes somewhat more relevant, because one of the best illustrations can be found by imagining time travel, specifically travel back in time. Suppose someone travels back in time about a week or so. One of the key aspects of most time travel stories is that the person who goes back in time will know that he or she has gone back in time, but no one else will. In fact, Often writers will put in restrictions on characters bumping into the previous version of themselves because the previous version of themselves would not have known either. But that's beside the point. The point I want to emphasize here isn't really the main character who understands that they go back in time. It's the other people who aren't even in the plot of the story. If you want an example, think of the people in Sydney, Australia during the events of the first Back to the Future movie, which takes place in Hillsdale, California, if I recall. So none of the people in Sydney, Australia ever interacted with Marty McFly, so their lives would have repeated exactly as they had the first time through the timeline. And it is that exactness of the repetition that is the point that makes this determined. They are determined to do what they do because there is literally no other option for them but to do what they did the first time. In other words, if we rewind the tape and press play, just like rewinding a movie, well, the movie's plot doesn't change because you rewound and played it again. It's the exact same movie the second, third, or 500th time that you've watched it. And the same thing applies if we're thinking of the timeline itself. Every single person who was around made decisions, but importantly, those decisions were made because of the information that these people had, because of their emotional state, because of their exact subjective feeling, and everything else that goes into making decisions. But because time is repeating, every single factor that made up their decisions is exactly the same the second time through. So they will make the exact same decisions again. Which ultimately means before the first time we went through this timeline, those exact same things were exactly what they were going to be for the choice that ended up happening. So it would have been possible for someone with infallible knowledge to know exactly what each one of these people would choose the first time through. Their choices, therefore, would be predetermined, which is to say the outcome was always inevitable. If we contrast this with the idea of libertarian free will, if we were to rewind time and let it play forward again, every decision has the potential to be other than it was the first time through. Suppose that Sally said something mean to Mary, so Mary decides to spit in her sundae. But we rewind time and it starts again, and now Mary decides this time to just dump the sundae onto the ground instead. This is what most people who hold to libertarian free will would assert is at least a possible reality. They hold that Mary is responsible for her choices because of the principle of alternative possibilities. That is, she's responsible because she could have done otherwise. And therefore, they would argue that someone who could not have done otherwise, that is, someone who is predetermined towards a certain choice, cannot be held morally responsible for whatever they did. Now, before I respond to that directly, let me first quickly address one common confusion that people have with determinism here. I've lost count the number of times that I've discussed this topic and been told that determinism is just fatalism. Now, there's a surface level where it looks like they are the same, but there's a vastly important distinction between determinism and fatalism, which renders the two views nearly polar opposites. In fact, I will later argue that the idea of libertarian free will is actually closer to fatalism than determinism is. See, the idea of fatalism comes to us originally from the Greek concept of the Fates, which were a group of three goddesses in Greek mythology, which served as the role of determining the destiny of all mortals at birth. Now, at first glance, that does sound like it would be the same as determinism. But what differs is that in fatalism, no matter what you did, your fate was sealed. In fact, many of the Greek stories involved people trying to avoid their fate, but thereby ending up enacting their fate. For example, there was the prophecy given to Oedipus that he would kill his father and marry his mother. So Oedipus's parents, who heard this prophecy, left him to die. Thus, Oedipus grew up in Corinth not knowing who his parents were. So when he learned of this prophecy, he then left Corinth to avoid fulfilling it. But while he was traveling, he meets with this old man. They end up quarreling, and he kills him. Unbeknownst to Oedipus, that old man was his biological father. Later, he becomes king of Thebes, and he marries his mother, because he doesn't know that she's his mother. This is how fate is typically presented in the stories. And this is what fatalism finds its roots in. No matter what you do, you cannot escape your fate. But this clearly isn't the same thing as determinism. See, with fatalism, if Oedipus was a real person, just go with it for the illustration, then if we rewound time, he could possibly grow up knowing who his real parents are, and the fates would have still intervened at some point to engineer the death of his father at his hands. It would be a radically different story, but the end result would be the same. On determinism, however, if you were to rewind time, the events would have to occur exactly as they did the first time once again. There would be no deviation because, and this is the key aspect, If there were deviation, then the ending would have to be different too. In other words, fatalism completely obliterates the idea of causality. These things happen no matter what you choose to do. So that would mean your choices aren't relevant to the end point. But in determinism, causality is preserved. Things happen because those specific events leading to that specific end happened the way they did. And there was no other outcome given those causes. And this difference between fatalism and determinism actually holds the key as to why determinism upholds the idea of moral responsibility, which libertarian free will does not. Because libertarian free will has the same flaw that fatalism has, in that libertarian free will undermines causality completely. And if there is no causality, there cannot be any responsibility at all. So we'll unpack why that is so. But first, we'll need to get a good foundation to build upon. Let's consider a relatively benign example to start with in order for us to understand how choices work in the first place. Suppose that it's early morning and Aaron is hungry, so he goes to his fridge. In his fridge, he has eggs and he has leftover pizza. We'll just limit it to those two items for now. Aaron can choose to either fry an egg or he can eat his leftovers. So there we go. A choice is when someone can pick between multiple options, right? Well, it's not quite that simple. See, there are many different factors that could influence why Aaron could choose one or the other. Since the pizza is left over from the previous day, he might want to eat it before it gets too old. But maybe the pizza is left over because it was subpar and he didn't actually enjoy eating it the previous night. Still, even if he didn't enjoy it, it may be less work for him to quickly warm a slice in the microwave rather than pulling out a pan and frying an egg. So there are a multitude of influences that could affect how Aaron decides on what he will eat for breakfast. So let's just sort of group all of those motivations together into a box. Each of these provide a desire either to or from a particular choice. All of these desires percolate around inside the mind of Aaron, and he may or may not be aware of any one of them consciously. But we know that these desires are there because if Aaron makes a choice, say he picks frying an egg, then we can ask him, why did you decide to fry an egg instead of eating the pizza? And he can provide his reasons for doing so. Perhaps it was, I decided to fry an egg because I wanted something warm, but heating pizza in the microwave would have made it too dry. Whatever it may be, Aaron can point to how he sorted these desires and why he then picked what he did. So at first glance, it might be tempting to just say it was Aaron sorting through these desires that constitutes the act of choosing. And there's certainly an aspect of that which provides our foundation if we're thinking about what constitutes a choice. The problem is that the desires themselves have a strength assigned to that desire before Aaron even begins to sort through them. That is, Aaron may have had a very strong desire to have hot food because he woke up feeling chilled. He didn't consciously choose to have that as a strong desire. It's just how things cashed out for him when he got to the point of choosing what to eat. To say that he sorted the desires into a hierarchy and picked it above all others isn't really accurate. He simply felt a very strong desire towards hot food, and the strength of that desire therefore pulled him towards a certain option and away from others. But by the same token, we cannot say that his mind was completely separated from having any input into that level of the strength of the desire either. For example, Aaron could have an identical twin named Brad, and Brad, when facing the exact same input, may actually prefer feeling colder to feeling hot, and therefore the exact same unconscious sensation that caused Aaron to heavily prefer a hot fried egg may cause Brad to heavily prefer a cold slice of leftover pizza. And this gets us to one of the conundrums when it comes to choosing. If you ask Aaron, he will say that he chose what to do because he felt a strong desire in one way or another, but Aaron did not sit down and choose which desire would be stronger than any of the others. Most, if not all, of his desires were completely beyond his control. Yet, if you were to ask Aaron, did you freely choose to eat a fried egg this morning, he would almost certainly respond with yes, even though he had no control over which of his desires would be most likely to influence him at any particular time, and even when Brad could have the exact opposite reaction with the exact same inputs. So why does he still feel as if his choice was free? I think that's because each of us recognizes when we are forced to make a choice we do not wish to make. Every one of us, as a child at least, has been forced to choose between such decisions as do you do your chores or do you face the consequences? Under our preferred universe, we do not want to do our chores, but we also do not want to face the consequences. To us, we feel like both decisions are bad, and yet we are forced to do one or the other. To make the dichotomy even more stark, let's consider Aaron walking to the subway when a mugger shows up with a weapon and says, "Give me your wallet or face the consequences." Clearly, Aaron does not want to give his wallet to the mugger, yet he may feel compelled to do so in order to escape violence against his person. In such a scenario, Aaron would still be engaging in the strongest desire, the desire to not experience physical harm, yet clearly he would not define this experience as being a free choice. It's tempting to think that the biggest difference between Aaron choosing his breakfast and Aaron choosing whether to donate his wallet comes down to control. But when we think about it, Aaron doesn't have any more or less control over that choice than he did with his choice of breakfast. That is, Aaron didn't choose that he would react to the same stimuli as Brad in the exact opposite manner when he chose what to eat based on his desires, and he didn't choose to have the desire for self-preservation exceed that of his desire to keep his money in the case of the mugger. He simply chose what to do based on the interplay between the input that he's experiencing and his mental algorithm, so the idea of control really isn't relevant to that process. Instead, it appears to me that what makes Aaron's breakfast choice feel free while his choice under the mugger feels coerced isn't so much control, but instead it's based on the origin of that motivation. That is, when Aaron chose his breakfast, his desire for fried eggs came from within himself. When he chose to hand over his wallet, his desire to do so was imposed on him externally from the mugger. Indeed, if Aaron was walking down the street and he saw a homeless man and he felt compassion stir inside of him so that he gave the homeless man his wallet, the same exact action, Aaron losing his wallet, would happen. But in this second case, the origin of the desire to give up the wallet has come from within Aaron himself, not being imposed from an outside mugger. So I would argue that what makes the choice free or compelled is whether or not the desire originates in oneself or externally. Key to note with that is that the origin of the desire being in oneself does not at all imply that the desire itself is indeterminist. That is, under determinism, if we rewind time to the beginning of every morning, given the exact same circumstances, Aaron will always have the exact same strongest desire for which he will always choose to eat the fried egg. And he will always experience that choice as being free because it originates internally. In other words, given the exact same input, the desires, with the exact same mental state, Aaron's way of sorting desires, the exact same decision will always be made. It cannot be otherwise. In fact, the only way for Aaron to make a different choice is either to change the input or to change Aaron's mental state, or both, as this is not an exclusive or. But importantly, I make this claim. It is precisely because Aaron's mental state with this input will always produce the exact same choice that his choice can actually be said to be his choice. If Aaron's mental state is different, his choices are different. And if it is the same, his choices are the same. Therefore, his mental state is causing the choice that occurs. Let's contrast that with the Libertarian Free Will view. On Libertarian Free Will, Aaron could have had the exact same brain state with the exact same input and still decide to have cold pizza instead of a fried egg. That is, the principle of alternative possibility requires that Aaron could have made a different choice. So the exact same Aaron with the exact same desires could choose either option. Now, if we hold Aaron fixed so that he is not changing, but the decisions that Aaron makes do change, then Aaron is not the cause of what decision occurs. To see why, suppose that I have a button, and I claim that pushing the button causes a flame to appear on this wall. And you show me that you press the button and no flame appears. And furthermore, you later show that a flame appears even when the button is not pressed. Well, you've shown conclusively that whatever causes the flame to appear is, in actuality, it is not the button being pressed that is doing it. In the same way, if Aaron's decision to eat a fried egg doesn't depend on either him or the inputs of his desires, because we hold those fixed in this and Aaron has chosen differently, then whatever it is that makes Aaron's choice, it is not Aaron. Which brings me right into the topic of responsibility. Because under determinism, we can say for certain that Aaron is the one who chose what he did. If Aaron was different, his choices would have been different. But under Libertarian Free Will, Aaron is not responsible for what he did because his choices could be different even if Aaron is exactly the same. This is why I argue that only under determinism can responsibility even exist, because only under determinism are your decisions linked to who you are in such a way that the exact same you with the exact same desires will do the exact same actions. That you cannot have done otherwise is precisely why you are responsible for what you did. In fact, the libertarian free will model seems based on randomness, not upon the nature of the person making the choice. Why did Aaron choose one way this time and different way the next time when all the variables were exactly the same? Well, some kind of random fluke happened, I guess. I don't know. And to give a final example of why responsibility requires determinism, consider flipping a coin. Now, for this example, I'll also briefly include a theological concept of middle knowledge. It basically is the same as libertarian free will, but in order to preserve God's sovereignty, this view holds that God only instantiates the specific thread of history that fits his decree. So I'm not going to get into the merits or detriments of such a view here, but suffice to say, from my point of view, it's very much like save scumming. That's where if you're playing a video game and say you need to win a hand of poker in it, so you save the game, you get your random cards, and you play the game. If you lose, you just reload your save game and try it again. If you win, you make a new save and continue. That way, even though the results you got in the game were genuinely random, or pseudo-random in the case of a video game, you still controlled the outcome by the means of only saving the successes towards your goal. So, with that in mind, let's consider some options. Suppose we have a coin, which is weighted so that it will always land on heads. We throw the coin 10 times in a row, and we get heads 10 times in a row. Now, suppose that we have a fair coin that has a 50-50 shot. We throw the coin and save the game if it lands on heads, and reload if we need to until we get 10 heads in a row. Finally, consider the libertarian free will view where we have a fair coin and we just flip the coin 10 times and it just happens to land on heads 10 times in a row. You might think this is extremely low, but each coin has a 1 in 2 chance of being heads, and we're doing this only 10 times, so that means we have a 1 in 1,024 chance of having it happen by accident. While low, those are not impossible odds by any means. Now here's the kicker. Consider all these options: the determined coin game, the save scum game, and the libertarian free will game. Which of these versions had the result of 10 heads because of the coin? The save scum game has the result because the person saving and reloading the game caused it to happen that way. The libertarian free will game has a result because of a once in a 1,024 time fluke event. It just happens that often. Only the coin that is weighted to always land on heads gives a result of 10 heads because of the coin itself. Only in that instance can the coin be held responsible for the outcome. In any case, those are my thoughts on this. I do look forward to your thoughts as well in the comments below, and I do hope you have a wonderful day. Peace out.